I'd like to introduce this morning Doris Hugh, who comes from Egypt, and is going to tell us her journey from Egypt to London, her exodus. Doris is going to speak for a little while, and then Josiane Gold is going to question her. Josiane also comes from Egypt, and then we'll be open to questions. Over to you, Doris.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to start actually by talking about my British nationality, which after all is the reason why I am in this country. My father was a Syrian Jew born in Aleppo in 1907, and he liked to talk about his Indian roots. The family name was Gabe, and the cousin on that side of the family actually did some interesting research and found out some information. So the mid-19th century was a time when extensive Ottoman Empire was declining, and European countries were beginning to offer nationalities to Christian minorities. For Britain, it was slightly different because there were very few Protestants that they could protect. So they decided that they would protect, in inverted commas, Jews, telling the Turks that these Jews actually were originating from Indian families with British roots. And there were letters from the British consuls in Aleppo, which showed that the registers were in such confusion that they abandoned all attempts to regulate them. The consuls were aware that many of these, so to speak, British Jews had lived in Aleppo since time immemorial. And in fact, in one letter that an ambassador wrote to the ambassador in Constantinople, he talks about the vast majority of persons enjoying British protection are Arab Jews of an alleged Indian origin. Calcutta is alleged by them to have been their place of origin. So this clears up the myth of our Indian roots. Nevertheless, we do remain British subjects. So in the mid-18th century, Aleppo was a very prosperous city where Jews often acted as agents for European merchants. And so it became a very important center of Jewish life. In 1869, however, the Suez Canal opened. And so the lucrative trade, which used to go, caravans which traveled to and from Aleppo, was diverted actually to the cheaper and easier sea route. And so the prosperity of Aleppo began to decline. And young men began to leave, mostly from Egypt, which had become quite prosperous at the time because of the cotton trade. Some went to North or South America, and some interestingly, and you'll find out later on why, some interestingly went to Manchester. So in 1910, my grandparents left Aleppo with my 3-year-old father to settle in Cairo in Egypt, which was still firmly under British protection. They had 4 more children before my grandfather died. My father was 11 at the time, but he had to leave school because he had to start work to support his mother and his siblings. Incidentally, I was terrified of my paternal grandmother because she only spoke Arabic and she looked very severe. My father, my uncles and aunts all spoke French because by then the Alliance Israélite Universelle had been set up in Paris in 1860, and that provided some sort of European education, particularly French, and it enabled the Jews also to acquire some secular knowledge. My parents' generation was probably the first one in Egypt to speak French as their first language. So I leave my father's story here for now and move on to my mother's story. On my mother's side, our surname was Israel. And a young cousin of mine, who is present today, has traced the family history back to 1807 in Sherez, or Ceres, which is about 50 miles from Thessaloniki and was actually home to rabbinical and prominent Sephardi families. So Rabbi Isaac Israel relocated from Sherez to Jerusalem with his 2 sons, Eliyahu, who was born in 1800, and Chaim Moshe, who was born in 1803. So he was nicknamed Rabbi Isaac Israel Sherezli to distinguish him from other Israels. Sherezli obviously means from Sherez, to distinguish him from other Israels who were living in Jerusalem at the time. His sons studied in yeshivot in Jerusalem and both became rabbis. Hayim Moshe's branch of the family remained in Jerusalem and they retained the nickname Shrezli but dropped the Israel. My branch of the family is descended from Eliyahu. They dropped the nickname Shrezli and retained Israel. Sorry, they adopted Israel and they dropped Shrezli. And then in 1846, Eliyahu was appointed chief rabbi of Egypt by the Sultan of Constantinople, who also decorated him during his lifetime. And he remained a chief rabbi of Egypt until his death in 1866, and he's buried in Cairo. Eliyahu had 5 children, the eldest one of whom was Yom Tov Israel, my great-great-grandfather, who was born in Jerusalem in 1821 and died there in 1891. In 1866, shortly after his father's death, Yom Tov succeeded him as chief rabbi of Egypt. But even before then, he'd been prominent in the Cairo Jewish community. And like his father, he was decorated eventually by the Sultan. He's also the author of a book on Jewish Egyptian customs entitled Minhagei Mitzrayim. And he was the last chief rabbi of the family. His sons opted for more lucrative careers in business, in banking, in the stock exchange, and the cotton trade as well, rather than religion. Yom Tov was a wise and interesting man. He was a patriarch, he was head of the family, he was a religious leader and guide, he was very respected. He was also renowned for his interest in the poorer people in Egypt and for trying to get the wealthier people to contribute. And that was quite difficult at the time because the construction of the Suez Canal was starting, the cotton industry was developing, the rich Jews really preferred to flock around Europeans rather than to help the needy. In 1883, when he was in his early 60s, Yom Tov decided that he really wanted to die in Jerusalem where he'd been born. So he left Egypt and he settled in the new suburb of Ohel Moshe in the Nalaot district. That was one of the very first new suburbs established outside the old city. But he remained chief rabbi of Egypt until his death in 1891. His deputy became the locum, dealing with day-to-day matters, but for the important matters which needed a signature, the community leaders either traveled to Jerusalem to get his signature, or else he came back to Egypt. So I asked my cousin really the reason why Yom Tov was allowed to remain chief rabbi of Egypt when he wasn't even living there. And his reply was that Yom Tov was a good leader who had good relations with the Egyptian government, and the community wanted to retain him as their leader until they could appoint somebody respectable and suitably qualified. He died in August 1891, and he's buried on the Mount of Olives. And his grave actually was lost, well, not lost, but we couldn't find it for a long time. But eventually in 1977, one of my uncles and his cousin found it, and it has since been renovated, and I have visited it. His house in Mahane Yehuda is also still there. As my cousin puts it so beautifully, the paternal side of my mother's family provided the rabbis, the maternal side provided the synagogues. So the Etz Chaim synagogue was built by my great-grandfather, Ibrahim Hanan, and his brother Baruch, in a district of Cairo called Daher or Zaher. That was at the beginning of the 20th century. It still exists, but it's in poor condition. There's another synagogue, which is called Neve Shalom, and that was built by Ibrahim's father-in-law in the Abbasiyya district of Cairo. This one was said to be actually even bigger than the Great Temple in Cairo. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the 1960s, 1970s. There's one more thing really about my mother's side of the family, because on that side we were Italians, and you may well ask, well, how did we get to be Italians, having come originally from Spain, and Jerez, then Israel, and we've been in Egypt since the 19th century. Well, in those days in Egypt, you could buy nationalities, and the Italians were only too delighted to sell theirs. So hundreds of Egyptian Jews took advantage of this. And then very conveniently, in 1873, a fire broke out in the town hall in Livorno, destroying all public records. So overnight, a lot of Egyptian Jews could claim that they were originally from Livorno. The Israelis bought Italian nationality in the 1880s, with Livorno, of course, as their place of origin. And now for my story. So I was born on the 8th of May, 1944, 1 year before VE Day. My father was in the British Army in Palestine at the time. I grew up speaking French because that was a language that the Jews had adopted. It was actually the second language in Egypt and the first that really all the Europeans spoke. Of course, I spoke Arabic too. You had to speak Arabic. Sounds awful to say, but you had to speak it to converse with domestic staff. And then also in several areas of everyday life. But in the shops and everywhere, really, you got to buy in French. The other interesting thing was it was compulsory to pass the Arabic exam, even though I was in a French school in the Lycée Français. And ironically, the ones who failed the Arabic exam and had to stay down a year were the Egyptian girls, rather than the Egyptian Jewish girls. With family and friends, as I said, you really conversed in French. So we really lived in a very French, very European society. I loved life in Egypt. I loved everything about it. First and foremost, I loved actually being part of such a close-knit family. I had loads of cousins because both my father and my mother came from families of 5. We all went to the lycée together. We all spent afternoons together. We either went to clubs, outdoor clubs, which obviously was the thing in Egypt, or we went to each other's houses. As a family by then, we weren't particularly religious. In fact, you would describe us really as secular Jews. My father and many Jewish men attended synagogue, perhaps more frequently, but the mothers and the children really went already for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, infrequently for other occasions. Yes. My favorite memory of synagogue is actually going with my father on Erev Pesach as the firstborn. I loved eating the biscuit and drinking the wine. I felt so grown up. And the Hagim were amazing because we celebrated one night with my father's family, one night with my mother's family, but wherever we were, once the meal was over, my sister, my cousins and I used to go into hiding in one of the bedrooms and we'd keep as quiet as possible, hoping our parents would forget about us and allow us to stay there until they went home as well. And then there was the weather, which was wonderful, really wonderful. At least the winters were. We didn't have spring and autumn as such. We only had 2 seasons, summer and winter. So there was hardly any rain, and if a few drops of rain dared to fall, we weren't allowed to walk to school. We had to take what was called the Arabeya Hantour, which was a horse-drawn carriage. Summers in Cairo, on the other hand, were unbearable, and so we didn't complain about that. But we had to have 3 months holidays at the seaside with our mothers. Our fathers accompanied us there. They settled us, and then they went back to Cairo for the working week, and then came back again at the weekend. I actually think that they enjoyed their life in Cairo during the working week, away from annoying kids and nagging wives. But they did spend the whole month of August with us. So the resorts we went to were either Alexandria or, more often than not, a little resort called Ras El Bar, which was a small resort, as I said, the confluence of the Nile and the Mediterranean. It means head of the land, and that's the reason why. So we all went there. It was a kind of exodus from Cairo to Ras El Bar. Family, friends, relatives, neighbors, and we rented beach huts for the entire summer. That was really great fun. I mean, it was just transporting our life from Cairo to holidays. Swimming in the soft waters of Nile as well was totally different from swimming in the Mediterranean, even though the Mediterranean is my sea and I love swimming in it, but Nile was different. And I remember water skiing behind boats, which we used to hire to get to a little resort called, a little beach rather, called La Gerba. It's difficult to really describe our summers there. Because 3 months is a long time, but there are some events that stick in my mind, and some of them you're going to find probably quite distasteful. So one was, it was the custom in Egypt to have a siesta, and the kids hated the siesta. So we all used to wait until our parents fell asleep. And then with the help of our maids, we used to sneak out and play outdoors. That was really nice. Our mothers used to use olive oil to protect us against the beating sun. I think they'd be in prison nowadays for this. Then there was street vendors coming around in the morning selling what was called lucumades. That was the equivalent of the Spanish churros, if anybody's tasted those. And they were delicious for breakfast. I have pictures of my sister dancing the belly dance on tabletops in restaurants. And then, wait for it, headless chickens running on the streets for a few seconds after their throats had been slit. So it was quite an eclectic and colorful mixture of memories. Fashion was decidedly European, and the women used to like to show off in the latest dresses. Then there was the outdoor life, and that was actually really what I remember most about Egypt. The open air cinemas, the mixture of American and Egyptian films that they used to show, public concerts with internationally famous singers like Kulthum. She was the Egyptian singer at the time and well known all over the world. And on holiday, there were very sophisticated beach clubs, obviously with people older than me. In the words of another cousin, Egypt at the time was Hollywood on the Nile. And actually celebrity spotting was quite easy for me because in the building where we lived in Cairo on the same floor lived Faten Hamama. She was a very popular Egyptian film star at the time. And she was engaged to Omar Sharif, who was a frequent visitor. So I saw him regularly. There was a very famous landmark in Cairo called Groppi. That was a French salon de thé with Louis XVI's furniture, delicious pastries, delicious ice creams. It was a treat to go there. When I went back to Cairo in 1989, I was so disappointed. I had boasted to my husband about how amazing Groppi was. And we found low tables and low stools and the beautiful vitrines filled with Egyptian pastries. Not that I have anything against Egyptian pastries. I love Egyptian pastries, but somehow the vitrines didn't look the same. The only remnant of its former glory was the Sheffield porcelain tiles in the restrooms. Meals were a ritual in Egypt as well, and I loved Middle Eastern food, particularly actually, I loved what we call the baladi food, which is the food of the peasants. So things like tamaya, falafel, or foul medames, which we ate in pembaladi, which was the Arab bread. Molokhaya, which was a horrible mixture, but eventually I grew to like it. But anyway, we did, of course, have the more sophisticated Middle Eastern and European foods as well. The other thing that I remember about life in Egypt was actually eating chilled watermelon with something that resembled feta cheese on the balconies and talking across buildings to our neighbors so that everybody could hear our secrets. In fact, shouting from one window to another was by far the easiest way to communicate and far more efficient than the telephone, which was just starting to be introduced in Cairo. I love the scents in Egypt. Now, yes, you will say there were horrible smells, and there were horrible smells, but you couldn't really beat the scent of the jasmine necklaces, which were in street sellers' vending baskets as you walked along the streets. And then there was a very special tradition in Egypt where, I'm not sure whether it was an Egyptian tradition or a Jewish tradition, but the women used to make rose water rather, or orange blossom water. And on those mornings when my mother had to make the water, she'd buy basketfuls of rose petals, boil them in a kettle, in a copper kettle, and the kettle was connected, the pan was connected to sort of a big pan with a long tube, and the tube went all down the apartment. It was a very complicated contraction. Anyway, when I came home, I remember when I came home from the lycée at lunchtime, I was always met by the strong scent of rose water or orange blossom water. And I have to admit, I feel quite nostalgic when I use these essences in my Pesach baking. I went to the lycée, as did my cousins and many of my friends. And school started at 7:45 in the morning with 15 minutes of gym. Now, you couldn't wish for rain to actually stop this happening because there wasn't any rain, as I said. But we all did gym there. That was for the entire school. My cousins who stayed in Egypt after 1957 when I left, they told me that the 15 minutes of gym was replaced by 15 minutes of marching around the playground, chanting the Quran, which they had to learn off by heart. When we finished at lunchtime, that was another very funny practice. There were some vendors outside the school and we used to buy all sorts of things from them. But one thing that sticks in my mind and which we discussed recently actually on our family WhatsApp was the tradition of buying caca chinois. Caca chinois means Chinese poo. It sounds awful, but it was actually a delicious mixture of black honey and flour. And it did look like yellow poo. Anyway, I'm not sure whether it still exists or not, but we used to love it. What I loved really so much about Cairo was the international mix and the multiplicity of languages. There were French, Greeks, Italians, Armenians, amongst others. And we always wanted to find the mot juste. And finding the mot juste sometimes, actually, you found it in another language rather than your own language. So the French we spoke was a mixture of French, yes, and English and Arabic and Italian and Spanish and various things like that. So it was really, it was different, but it was very interesting. As I remember it, we also got on extremely well with the Egyptians and we used to celebrate their festivals with them. We lived in the square that you see all the time on TV, Tahrir Square. We lived at number 15, and that was the center from which all the festivities started. There one particular Muslim festival that we used to love was called Sham el-Nassim. That was a festival of sugar dolls. So all the kids used to buy these enormous sugar dolls on sticks, and they used to march along the street holding these sugar dolls, and we used to join them with our mates. And then it all came to an end. My first memory of political trouble was in 1952, at the time of the revolution, when the king Farouk was deposed and Mohammed Naguib became the first president of the republic. There were demonstrations against the British, during which demonstrators set fire to British-owned buildings. And our apartment overlooked the BOAC building, which was set fire to. And to this day, when I smell fire, it takes me back to that time. Then one day in July 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who succeeded Naguib as the second president, or I should say maybe the pharaoh of Egypt, he nationalized the Suez Canal, freezing all foreign assets and closing the canal to Israeli shipping. Now, the Suez Canal was obviously very important because it connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean via the Red Sea, and it avoided having to circumnavigate around the African continent. So Israel, France, and Britain were not going to stand for this. Against the advice of the US and Russia, they launched military action to regain control of the canal. They won, but they were forced to retire by the US, giving full control of the canal to the Egyptians. And this became known as the Suez Crisis. And once again, the Suez Canal was actually impacting on my family life. The first I knew about the Suez Crisis was one day when I was walking home after my Italian lesson. And I was walking past a cafe and some of the Arabs there shouted, "Egri, Egri," which meant run, run. I heard bombs exploding. I was so frightened. I just ran as fast as I could and got to our building and ran up the stairs to find my mother. Over the next few days, we lived through a series of bomb alerts, though no bomb ever hit Cairo. But we still had to keep the curfew. The windows were all blacked out. We had to have blue lighting at night. The shrill sound of sirens actually going off at regular intervals was quite horrendous. And if I ever hear a siren, even now, I'm filled with fear. Needless to say, school was shut and life was changed beyond belief. So what's new? A few days after the fighting ended, Nasser decided that he was going to expel all French and British subjects. So most people were given just 2 weeks to actually pack up, surrender their possessions, and leave. I remember very clearly that early morning when the doorbell rang and the policeman standing outside the door handed my father the letter which contained our expulsion order. We were lucky in that my father knew someone in government and our departure was delayed by a further 2 weeks. The date was set as the 3rd of January, 1957. So my parents spent those 4 weeks clearing the house, preparing for our imminent departure. The beautiful furniture and the rugs that we had were sold for a pittance. Everything was really. I remember my mother arranging bed linen, tablecloths, ornaments on tables, and she sold the table with the content for £10 each. It was heartbreaking. The Egyptians used to just turn up at the house saying, or the apartment saying that we were leaving and they wanted to see what we had to sell. Most of our clothes were given away as well. My sister and I were used to running around in lightweight clothes, instead of which my mother bought us long grey skirts, tweed skirts, long grey woolen socks, coats, scarves, hats. It was awful. And then the worst of all was that she cried all the time. And there was a very depressed atmosphere, both in the house and in our family at large. And finally, January the 3rd arrived. So we were leaving on the coach for the airport in the very early morning, and all the family came. That's aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone was there. Everyone was in tears because we had no idea when, if ever, we were going to see each other. We had no idea what was waiting for us in England. We didn't speak the language. We knew no one there. Our only connection was our British passport. So we were really frightened. And on top of that, we were destitute because my parents were only allowed to take out 5 Egyptian pounds each. Our arrival at the airport was another momentous event. Taking valuables, jewelry, precious stones, of course, was strictly forbidden. But as always, people tried to smuggle them out in specially modified shoes, in the lining of coats, in hems, in suitcases. And some even swallowed diamonds. So we were searched very thoroughly, of course. And I was petrified when the customs officer grabbed hold of my doll, which I adored, pulled out the head and looked inside. Now, the head never did fit properly after that, but the doll still came with me to England. My mother was not allowed to take her engagement ring, of course, and so that had to be entrusted to an official of the airline company that one of my older cousins worked for. And our passport was stamped with no return. In those days, aircraft couldn't carry enough fuel to travel from Cairo to London. And so we had an overnight stop in Vienna, in a very nice hotel in Vienna. But to this day, I have no idea who paid for that hotel. Anyway, that night, I actually slept in very strange bedding. Remember, having come from Egypt, you slept just with a sheet or a very light blanket. But here we had these thick feather duvets. And when I woke up in the morning and I opened the window, I saw snow. That was awesome, because the nearest I'd got to snow up until then was just sticking cotton wool balls on windows around about Christmas time. And then we started the second leg of our journey, which was to an RAF base just outside London, where we spent our second night. And then the morning after, we traveled by coach to our unknown destination. On the way, we could see houses. And remember, we lived in apartments in big blocks in Egypt. So the houses was something very unusual for us. My mother loved the houses, and she kept wondering whether we were going to be given one of those to live in. A few hours later, we found ourselves in a refugee camp with barracks that was also an old army base. And that was in Eastwood, outside Nottingham. And I found out a few years later that was D.H. Lawrence's birthplace. But at the time, I didn't know it. Anyway, we were going to share this camp, Tom, we were going to share this camp with Hungarian refugees who had left Hungary after the revolution. So when we got off the coach and walked into the canteen with its really greasy smell of food, my mother's reaction was devastating. She just broke down in tears. And a very nice Hungarian lady came and put her arms around her, and they became very good friends. The days that followed were hard. Well, when I say hard, they were hard for my parents, but for my sister and me, it was actually very exciting, despite the horrible smells. Everything was new. There was TV in the canteen. Now, we didn't have TV in Egypt. There were rock and roll songs. Yes, we'd heard Bill Haley and the Comets when we were in Egypt, but there were stars like Elvis Presley, Tommy Steele, Cliff Richard, and even things like grilling bread on the hot plate outside the dormitory that we shared with another family. That was exciting because it was new. We weren't used to doing this kind of thing. Jewish families in Nottingham were very kind, and they invited us for Friday night dinners. But best of all was running around in the snow and making new friends. And my sister and I started to learn English. We went to an English school, of course, and we learned hymns too. And to this day, when I hear All Things Bright and Beautiful, my heart tightens up a little bit. I have a letter which my mother sent to one of her cousins in February 1957, so that was just 1 month after our arrival at the camp. And she talks about our life there, and I've translated extracts of it. So she says, Dear Yvonne, I'm trying to be as calm as possible so as not to upset the girls. Doris keeps on saying how much better our life in Egypt was. Unfortunately, we dislike everything here, and life is so tiring. We have to queue up for our meals morning, noon, and evening, each with a tray. Can you imagine Mona? That was my sister who was 9 years old. Can you imagine Mona carrying her tray and looking for somewhere to sit? At first, I hated doing this, but luckily you get used to anything. Breakfast is an egg, ham, butter, and jam. Lunch is rarely good. The food is so different from ours. Every day we get the same menu, little bits of meat, tinned soup, mashed potatoes, or chipped, fried in an unpleasant grease. Dinner is the same. Now I make breakfast for all of us in our dormitory, and in the evening, Meyer, that's my father, brings us our meal. Meyer has been in London since yesterday. He has to see a man who owns a textile factory. We are very depressed because wages are so low. As soon as Meyer has found a job, I will apply for one. I will have to help out so that we can make ends meet. I will do some sewing. I expect that the girls will continue to have lunch at school and be out before. So I will therefore be able to leave the house during the day and work. As it happens, she never did work. A month later, my husband discovered that he had cousins in Manchester. And so he decided that we were going to live there. They had, of course, come to Manchester from Aleppo. I was devastated. In a way, leaving a refugee camp was almost worse than leaving Egypt because I had adapted to a new way of life and was once again going to be uprooted. So I cried when we left the camp. Manchester provided yet another set of experiences. We lived on the top 2 floors of a house that had been rented for us, and we had fireplaces there. So I had to go down to the cellar to get coal. I didn't mind at all doing that. I didn't mind the black dust. I didn't mind getting my hands dirty because coal was something totally new. And then also I loved the warmth of the coal fires. We had a garden. We didn't have garden in Egypt. We had a garden where my sister and I used to play hide and seek. We made friends with the family just down the road, and we used to go to their house and watch TV. One experience I'm ambivalent about, however, was being given clothes by a charity. Now, only a few months later, we wore beautiful clothes, and now we were being clothed in other people's cast-offs, and that was quite humiliating. So I was 12 when we left Egypt, and I had passed the equivalent of the 11 plus, and I had all my certificates with me. And I was very lucky. I ended up in a grammar school in what is now called Year 8. When I arrived at Central High School in Manchester, I felt actually, in March 1957 this was, I felt very isolated and very different. I kept being asked questions such as, did you live in a tent in the desert? Did you walk barefoot? Did you ride on camelback? Were you a nomad? No. I think this was when I missed Egypt most, really. Cairo was a cosmopolitan, elegant city where we mingled with so many nationalities. We heard and we spoke so many languages. We led such a culturally rich life, and we enjoyed such wonderful weather. And all these girls knew was what they had read in textbooks. So I became determined. I was going to show my teachers and my friends that I was good as anyone else in the school, and that I had not come from an underdeveloped country, but from an advanced country where we were tolerant of others. Well, at the time we were. So I loved getting down to my studies. I learned English properly. And by the end of the year, I was top of the class. And I felt very proud when I collected my first prize at Speech Day at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. I won the first prize every year after that, until the age of 18. And then I left school actually with the highest honor, which was the, as the school dux, and that was as the school academic leader. I made many new friends at school, but I did actually find some of their customs very strange. So tea for me was what we call in French le goûter, and that consisted of a piece of cake, a couple of biscuits, and a cup of tea. Tea in our Northern English household was alien. It consisted of hard-boiled eggs, sandwiches, tomatoes, cucumbers, jelly, and some kind of custard, which was actually trifle and which I hate to this day, and a cup of tea. Anyway, I eventually got used to some of these things. We were very lucky, really, in that well, not really, I mean, this happened to all the Egyptian refugees, but we were very lucky in that the Anglo-Egyptian companies looked after us until my father could find a job. In 1960, my parents bought a house, and that is, I think, the time when we felt we had settled down. My mother's sisters and their families stayed with us on their way to Australia because that's where they chose to live. And they wanted us to join us there. And my parents did toy with the idea, but eventually decided against it. I think my father really couldn't face another uphill struggle and upheaval really at his age. My mother never forgave him because she wanted to be reunited with her sisters. And she mentioned this in several letters. When I now look back on those early years in England, I can see the difference between my father and my mother. And again, Tom, reminiscences of your story. My father was a fighter who had a positive outlook on life, and he never looked back. He was 50 when we arrived. He couldn't speak much English, only what he'd learned in the British Army, and life was not easy for him. But it was important for his pride to find a job and to support his family and to give us a standard of living close to what we had in Egypt. But that was not possible, of course, because he had no qualifications, no real professions, no references, no knowledge, and then wages were very low. Yet he was ever the optimist. He did eventually find a job, and we had a reasonable life. If anyone has read Lucette Lanyadou's book, The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit, my father was exactly like hers. My mother, on the other hand, did not look forward. She always regretted life in Egypt and missed her sisters and family. That didn't stop her being a very good mother and doing the best for us and always being available, especially when I had children in London and needed her help. She was always ready to come and help out. My parents did actually have a very good social life in Manchester. Because Jews inevitably find each other, and there was a very wide Egyptian and Syrian Jewish family. They all used to go out together in the evenings and play cards together. And even though my mother enjoyed this side of life, these were her friends. They were not her family, and they were certainly not her sisters. I wouldn't say that England or Manchester really felt like home to me. And I still miss my aunts and uncles and cousins very, very much. I also miss my nanny, Sayeda. She was a Sudanese woman, and I loved her very much. She was so kind. But in England, I had opportunities which I would not have had in Egypt, such as going to university. Because in Egypt, when they finished schools, girls just stayed at home, and they eventually got married and had children. And then they had a busy social life. Of course, I wanted that, but by then I'd acquired European values. I wanted to learn, I wanted to develop my mind, I wanted to go to university, and only then did I want to get married and have children. So I had to fight very hard really to get my parents to let me go to university, and the only way I could think of doing it was to ask my headmistress to call them in. She did, and she had to convince them that it was the right course of action for me. Very reluctantly, especially my father, they accepted, but that was on the condition that I stayed in Manchester and lived at home. Well, that was a small price to pay, really, for 4 amazing years at university, including 1 year in Paris when I was an English language assistant. And I managed to get to Paris by just convincing my parents that this was a compulsory part of the course. It wasn't actually, but anyway, I wanted my year in Paris away from home. I got married after I left university, and when 18 months later we moved down to London, I cried again, but this time it was because I was leaving my parents behind. Our 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, were all born in London. When I could start to work, my first job was at Habs Girls' School. And after 3 years, I moved to Habs Boys, where I had probably the best 17 years of my teaching career. Our 4 children all went to haberdashers too. I've now spent 26 very happy years at Southampton High School in very different capacities of positions of responsibility, but now really in a semi-retired capacity. And we have 11 wonderful grandchildren. None of this would have happened, of course, if we hadn't been expelled from Egypt. Looking back on it, leaving Egypt was both traumatic and liberating. Deep inside, I think I always knew I was going to leave. I didn't want the kind of life where girls are restricted in what they can do. One of my cousins was studying chemistry at the University of Marseille, and I wanted to do the same. But he was a boy, and I was a girl. And if we had stayed in Egypt, I think that probably I would have fought very hard to actually get to Europe. But I think that with the strength of the family, of the entire family behind them, my parents would have probably won and got me to just stay in Egypt and follow tradition. So, as I had mentioned, I went back to Egypt in 1989, and actually I was very sad to see how dilapidated Cairo had become. I visited my old apartment, which had become a medical cabinet by then. I had to struggle to persuade the caretaker to let us in, but once he understood that I lived in Egypt, my Arabic had to come back to me then. Once he understood that I used to live there, he said, "Tfaddali, tfaddali," which means, you know, welcome, welcome. And he promptly offered us a cup of tea. We didn't really want to accept anything because we were scared of drinking or eating anything outside the hotel, but we did. Anyway, I relived all my memories there. And then I went to my old school, the Lycée Français, which was no longer a French school, but an Arabic school. The only section of the school where they still spoke French was the kindergarten. And we were taken around by one teacher, and in every class, the kids got up and either recited a poem in French or sang a song in French. It was very moving. My Arabic, as I said, came back to me, and I was able to converse with some of the taxi drivers. They urged me to come back to Egypt and to bring my parents back. They said it was my country. Yes, it was, of course, but then the Egyptian government chose to expel us. I couldn't say this to the taxi drivers because they were very kind, and I knew they wanted to make us feel welcome. So I find it very hard, even now, after all these years, when I'm asked about my nationality. I can't say I'm English. So I don't feel English, even though I have lived here for most of my life. I'm not French, even though French is my native language. I'm not Egyptian, even though I was born in Egypt and lived there for several years. So the best thing I can come up with is I'm an Egyptian-born, French-speaking British subject, which is quite a mouthful. Mine was the last generation to have known and left Egypt. There are just a very few Jews left there now, mostly women. And when they die, there will be no one there. And that, I think, is very sad. So every year at Pesach, we celebrate our Exodus. But there's still a little bit of my heart left in Egypt. And so I'm not sure that I'll really celebrate my Pesach at Pesach time. My Exodus, sorry, at Pesach time. That's it.
Thank you very much. Fascinating, really fascinating.
Thank you.
Very interesting, Doris. Thank you. You worked on that really hard and it came over beautifully.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Josie Ann?
Yes.
Are you there?
Thank you, Gillian. Yes, I'm here. Doris, that was wonderful. It was an absolute joy to listen to these glorious images you painted of life in Egypt, and also to hear the story of the Exodus, because I mean, I was born in Egypt too, as Gillian mentioned. I was born in Alexandria in 1956, days after the end of the Suez War, and we were expelled. And I was 6 months old when we left. My father left before, and then my mother left a few months later with me. And so I have none of those memories, and to listen to you talking through that life that you had, and which my parents sometimes alluded to, but never really spoke about in detail because it was painful.
Yeah.
So to hear that from you was very, very special. Thank you for that. Now I'm going to just open some questions. I'm sure that there are others who've got questions, so I'm not going to monopolize here. I'm just going to start with 2 or 3 questions. I mentioned, of course, that I was born in Alexandria. Very recently, there was the rededication of the main synagogue of Alexandria, the Eliyahu Hanavi, and I went back for that rededication, and it was wonderful to see the renovated synagogue and to actually enjoy a service with 180 people in that synagogue. Now, of course, there are a lot of, there were many synagogues across Cairo and Alexandria, many fewer now, but I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the synagogues of Cairo.
Well, it's actually interesting because I was asking my cousins if they remembered what synagogue we used to attend. I think we used to attend what we used to call Le Grand Temple, which was the big synagogue, or the great synagogue, which was called Shar HaShamayim. And if we have time at the end, I do have some photographs. I can actually show a photograph of the synagogue. But I also have very vivid memories of a little synagogue, which we called Le Petit Temple, so the little synagogue. And that was attached to a charitable organization called La Goutte de Lait. And so that's the synagogue that I remember most. And I remember, well, even like now, kids in a synagogue service, they get bored, and so they go and play outside. And that's what we used to do. We used to play there. Yes, as I said, you know, we didn't go to synagogue that often. My father did, but I myself as a child didn't so much. But I've seen synagogues, as I say, there are about 3 or 4, I think, left in Cairo now. I'm not sure exactly how many. Probably my cousin André will know how many there are.
Certainly, I think there's a lot of work being done by Jewish associations to preserve.
I think actually there is a woman called Magda Haroun, who is one of the very few Jews living there. Now she's about 70, I think. And she's determined that there will be a Jewish heritage in Egypt. So she's making sure that she's preserving everything. In fact, I mean, when you think about it, there were about 80,000 to 100,000 Jews in Egypt in the early 50s. So it's a huge heritage which can't just disappear.
Well, I know that there are a few people on the call, my brother also on the call, Yves Fedida, who has been very involved with this process. So maybe later he can ask some questions and make some comments. But let me move on to the next question. You talked about the tolerance of life in Cairo. That was your tolerance, I think, to the people around you. But you know, anti-Semitism, of course, has sort of come up again as a heavy subject for us here. To what extent did you encounter anti-Semitism in Egypt? And, you know, to what extent, you know, how would you compare it perhaps to, you know, to life here?
Well, I haven't experienced anti-Semitism here either, but I certainly didn't in Egypt. I know it must have existed, and it certainly did after the creation of Israel. So in 1948-49, and a lot of the Egyptian Jews did actually leave Egypt because of the anti-Semitism. I myself never really experienced it. I think what I experienced more was perhaps not racism against the British. So, for example, in Egypt, when you took exams, you wrote your name and nationality, but you stuck the edge of the paper, the corner of the paper. So the teachers didn't actually know whose paper they were marking. And then I don't know how, but one day my Arabic teacher realized that I was British. And she said, "Are you British?" I didn't know that. I thought you were Egyptian. So I said, "Yes, we have a British passport." But I felt that her attitude actually changed towards me then. And then, of course, as I said, there were the demonstrations in 1952 against the British. I don't know why there was so much resistance to the British, because after all, Napoleon conquered Egypt, and yet the Egyptians welcomed the French. They welcomed French culture. In fact, French was a kind of the lingua franca of the country. It was the language of intellectuals. But Britain was totally different. Sandy, I'm not sure. Did you feel that in Port Said?
Sandy, are you there?
Sandy, you need to unmute.
Well, I was quite young when I left Egypt, but obviously I have some of the memories that I've heard this morning, especially sugar dolls on the beaches, in the Mediterranean beach clubs, and lukumades. You know, it's a Greek word, and we still have lukumades in Greece now. So, but I can remember very little about Egypt. All I can remember is the Suez Canal, because we were based in Port Said, so which was very different. And of course, my father was chef d'affaires of the Suez Canal Company, so you know, he was forced to go in November 1956, but his papers came after we had left to go on a 3-month sabbatical in England. So my parents only had about 80 English pounds with them, 2 small children, and nothing else.
Well, that's more than the £5 my parents were allowed.
So any photographs, still, we had nothing. We had to live in one room in an aunt's house. Very strange days.
Yes.
Okay, Doris, before I open up the questioning more generally, there's one question I have to ask you, because when you were describing the food, I could almost smell it. that came with my parents to England, and my mother was a wonderful cook, and that's the food that I grew up with. Then I married an Ashkenazi Jew, and I'm fortunate to still be married to him, and introduced to a whole different sort of cooking. We have constant debates as to which is the better. But did you
definitely.
did you bring your cooking, that cooking with you, and do your children know it, and do they carry it on?
My daughter actually tries to carry it on. So I'm sure that you've all heard of Claudia Roden, and she's written this wonderful book on Jewish food, which is half about the Ashkenazis and half about the Sephardis. She has all the recipes that actually I inherited from my mother, and my daughter uses it quite a lot. Did I bring my children up with Mediterranean food? Yes, I did to a certain extent, but maybe not quite so much, because it takes a lot more preparation, and I was teaching, I had a busy life. But yes, certainly pastries. I mean, things like menenas, which were those delicious pastries we made around Rosh Hashanah time. It's pastry with dates inside, and a very intricate work on the pastry itself. It took my mother hours to make.
Absolutely.
Or things like warab ainab, which is vine leaves, which were stuffed with rice. That was delicious as well. So they grew up with some of those things.
Lovely, thank you. Well, on that note, please, Gillian, would you like to take over the questioning?
Do we have any special questions? I wanted to ask you, Doris, you said that some people went from Aleppo to Manchester.
Yeah.
Why did they do that?
I don't know, because Manchester actually was a home of textiles, and a lot of the trade in Syria was in textiles, and so they went there. And also, actually, of course, the Industrial Revolution, and Manchester was developing as a city. My father, when we lived in Egypt, I'm not exactly sure what he did when he was a young boy. But he was certainly in the textile trade and selling on commission. And for him, the obvious thing was to go to Manchester. For me, the obvious thing was actually to come to London, because his one of his sisters and his brothers, who came just before us, they ended up in London. And it would have been so nice to have grown up with my cousins on my father's side of the family, at least. But he chose for us to be in Manchester, and there we are. Anyway, I did move down to London, and I'm very friendly with my cousins, of course.
And your parents stayed in Manchester?
My parents stayed in Manchester, yes. I mean, they came down to us very often, actually. They came for all the festivals. They came to look after the children as well. In fact, my father died immediately after Pesach, and that was immediately actually after my visit to Egypt. We'd gone just before Pesach, and took lots of photographs, and came back and showed my father the photographs, and he was absolutely delighted to see them. And then the day after Pesach, he had a heart attack in our house, and it was too late. I mean, my husband, who saw him, said, "Get off the phone." I was on the phone to a friend, said, "Get off the phone, your father's not well." It was the Easter bank holiday weekend, and I remember we called the ambulance, but they took ages to come. I was running out to the street to see if they were coming. They came, but it was too late. By the time they came, he was brain dead. But it was interesting that he died just after I'd been to Egypt, and he'd seen all those photos and relived his memories as well.
Yep. Eleanor.
Yes.
Good. Hi, Doris. That was really brilliant. Even though I've known you for years and years, that was marvellous to hear. Now, my understanding from what you're saying is that you and your family were expelled because you had British passports, and following the Suez crisis, Nasser wanted Brits out. So that was the fact you were Jewish was not the salient point.
No, it wasn't. It was because the rest of the family, they had Italian passports or Spanish passports, and they stayed in Egypt. They left eventually of their own accord. I think everybody had left Egypt by 1962. But that, I say, that was of their own accord. And they went to France, or as I said, I've got a lot of family in Australia. My mother's cousins all went to Australia. So my mother's sisters, sorry, went to Australia.
So my question to you is, I understand that coming to Britain was an obvious thing. You'd been expelled because you were British, you had British passports. But what about going to Israel? I mean, it was sort of next door, you were you know, you were recognisably Jewish. Why didn't you go there?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm not sure that there was even the consideration of going to Israel. Somehow the Anglo-Egyptian company, as I say, took charge of us, and we were destined for England.
Right.
But yes, I agree. I mean, I think my life would have been totally different if we'd gone to Israel. Anyway, that's the best I can answer, really.
Did some of the expelled Jews go to Israel rather than...
Some did go to Israel, some went to Brazil as well.
Doris?
That's marvellous.
Yeah.
Can I just, two things. One is there were some Egyptians went to South Africa, funnily enough. We had one in our Muha, they were called. Mostly, just to give you a point of information, I spent a lot of time in Egypt, back and forth. Between 79 and 84, I was a correspondent for the BBC, but that's a long time ago. But I've been going back a lot since the events of 2011, and in fact, as recently as last February, a few weeks ago, and you'll be glad to know that Groppies,
Yes.
even though its standard has lowered, as you rightly said, it still exists and is serving lots of ice cream.
Arabic ice cream there rather than French ice cream.
Right. And more interestingly, perhaps your address, you said 15 in Tahrir Square.
Yes.
You mentioned the BOAC office.
Yes.
Well, the British Airways has an office in Tahrir Square, and I'm just wondering if it's right next door to where you lived.
Possibly. I don't know really. Yeah. But you're talking about Egyptians in South Africa. So one of my twins actually married a girl who has Egyptian roots as well. Her grandmother was born in Cairo. So there we are. We've got the family tradition carrying on a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's my oldest son.
Mummy. How did you find it coming from Egypt to England and having to adjust your Middle Eastern temperament to the temperament of the British?
Well, I was never as phlegmatic as the British were. In Egypt, you just went. I mean, you expressed yourself in tempers, in shouting, in whatever. It was just a totally different way of life.
I'd like to thank you very much, Doris. It was a fascinating morning, really interesting. And Egypt's loss was our gain, getting you.
Yes, unfortunately. But Egypt is not what it used to be, even though I think it is changing a little bit. And it is the most tolerant of the Arab countries, but it's still not what it used to be.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Josie, for helping.